now more and more for Germany as well, and so I think Germany would be very, very well advised to leave soon. And then, of course, you have also got all these problems that a lot of people don't really seem to want to work very hard, in the Eurozone, particularly in the south.
General, you want to jump in London? Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I just have one question then. The fact of the matter is, though, even when you look at disparity of wealth or the ideology of socialist government or communist government, that's not realized by these countries. In fact, it's realized by countries like Nordic nations or Japan, which basically is based on non-liberal type of capitalism, where the wealth disparity is a lot narrower than a lot of these countries. And longevity of jobs, for example, and security, education, all these things are being realized by a country that adhered to the very good mixture of liberal and particularly in strengthening the non-liberal type of capitalism. And so I think it's very wrong to say that, all the capitalism have not realized those ideologies. In fact, these countries have realized those ideologies a lot more than communist or socialist nations.
Chris, you want to jump in and reply to that?
Well, I think that, in terms of decision-making processes about social resources, I think that to conflate, taxation and regulation with socialism or communism is to avoid the more fundamental issue, which is democracy. In other words, what is the democratic constituency for determining how resources will be allocated, how capital will be invested, what kinds of jobs will be created.
May I just jump in there?
Go ahead, Martin, jump in. Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. I just want to say I just don't want, that this illusion still stands out that there's a big democracy in the United States. You just see in the Republican Party itself, huge voter fraud on Ron Paul, for example. There's only two major parties that don't even include anybody else in the debate. What kind of democracy is that? It seems more that there's this corporatism pulling like two puppets on strings. And I doubt that really we have this great democracy and freedom that everybody thinks in the United States, in as much as people think that there is this, that it's really there, particularly when you compare that with Asia, where they overbash the evil few, unelected Chinese communists or in Russia. But really, in reality, it's a lot of the key financial interests that pulling strings there in the United States and Eurozone. I would really call it democracy very, very carefully or cautiously.
General, if I can go back to you in London, one of the IMF reports where they talked about is the fiscal cliff in the United States. And they talk a lot about political risk in the United States. Is there the political will to address that issue? Because that's a cliff.
Well, I think this is a very delicate moment in the United States as well, isn't it? And what I really fear over here is that America running into the populism type of policies, and basically that's exactly what happened in Japan and what is happening in Japan, and look where it's brought us, basically almost 2 decades. We call it lost decade, but it's actually almost 2 lost decades. So I would say that, again, it goes back to the very first thing that we were talking about. It's very difficult at this point to make the decisive position. Yeah, at this moment, I think it's very difficult. I just hope that they don't run into the populism type of society and politics in the States.
Chris, are you optimistic or pessimistic on that point?
Well, of course, populism is a problem. In other words, kind of authoritarian demagogy. Dividing people nationally against each other. So, for instance, one issue in the United States has been anti-immigration. However, it's interesting that the parties in this election cycle are steering clear of that. So I'm not sure about the question of populism per se. To go back to a point that was made earlier about liberal versus illiberal or authoritarian or corporatist forms of capitalism, again, I think that what this leaves out is the question of democracy. That question I don't think is fully addressable by way of populism. I think that the old questions of socialism, how at a global level, what you see in the EU, for example, is the question of whether the EU is really constituted as a political body or not. In other words, what's the status of democracy in the EU? With respect to differences between countries like Germany and Greece or Germany and the UK, there is a question of what kind of democracy the EU constitutes, and therefore what kind of policy, what kind of politics is constituted there. And I think that that really raises the question of, from my mind, of socialism and of true democratic accountability.
Alrighty, we're almost out of time here. Martin, I want to give you the last word here. Are we going, or is the world going back into recession, or the recession getting deeper?